welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Emotions. I'm Anshin Texter, licensed dynamic emotional integration trainer and consultant and teacher of several courses, the befriending courses at Empathy Academy. This is Sherry Olander, who is also a teacher at Empathy Academy, licensed CEI trainer and consultant. And then Jennifer Asdorian is a licensed trainer and consultant as well, based out of Washington, D.C. So welcome. I'm so glad that you're here with me. Today we're going to talk about trust. So trust is such a fascinating topic because in my opinion, it begins with ourselves, right? You got to trust yourself first before you can really trust anybody else, seems like. Or maybe, well, we could get really convoluted really quickly with this. So let's start by looking at the emotions behind trusting yourself.
The first thing that comes to my mind is just in terms of like emotional integrity and being able to listen and respond to your emotions. I think when so many of us are in the habit of denying our emotions or not understanding them, and I think that leads to an inability to trust oneself, because it's like your emotions are your inner kind of information system about like what's true. And if you repeatedly ignore your emotional messages, it's going to be hard to figure out like what's true for you.
Such a good point. Yeah. So repressing your emotions or ignoring them or kind of shaming yourself out of having your emotions. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, fully agree. It's like that first step, you have to be able to listen and respond. And when I was sort of sitting with this question and I was like, what emotions pop up for me when I trust myself? The very first word, the first three words that came were feeling assured, feeling my healthy shame would come up, and then also some anxiety. Now anxiety always comes up for me. So that's like, that's like always monitoring things. But I thought that it was the word assured was really interesting to me because that is not one that primarily comes forward. But when I really am feeling grounded and resourced and I've listened to my emotions, that assurance is that key. Like, oh yeah, no, I'm with myself. I understand this circumstance. And I trust what my next step is, right? That's what anxiety is coming in to say. And then shame is there just because I have to check in to make sure, is this, I would almost want to say, is this correct? Am I seeing this the way that I think I'm seeing it? Am I going with and honoring my contracts that I have in this relationship or the situation? So those are the first three words that came up, but then there's so many emotions that add into it. So it's like they all have their say in a way.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about shame. So, Sherry, when you said, if you might not even be able to acknowledge your emotions, right? That was honestly, that was one of my greatest learnings, was learning when I was doing the thing of ignoring what I was feeling, of
Mm-hmm.
saying to myself, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this. I'm
Right.
going to pretend it's not happening. And once I learned I was doing that, that was a contract, right? That was something that I learned to do as I should, or as like being a woman, you shouldn't have these emotions, right? And so once I was able to be aware of that contract, say, oh, I'm doing it again. I'm ignoring my emotions so that I can try to fit myself into this box of emotional correctness. Then accepting what I was feeling became a lot easier
Mm-hmm.
in general. And I could name it without judging myself of thinking, oh, I'm a bad person for feeling this emotion, or oh, I'm a weak person for feeling this emotion, or I'm unstable, or whatever. All of the judgments we have around the different emotions.
Yeah. I remember when I first came to this work and was learning about anger, and that it helps set boundaries and gives you a sense of self. And I didn't have much experience or access to anger or setting boundaries. I mean, not that I wouldn't get angry, I would, but I didn't have, it just would come and go so quickly because I had no experience of how to use it in a way to set boundaries or to help me kind of feel secure within myself. And I think that's because I had a lot of the shame contracts, and I had reached a point where I realized I was basically, before I would make any decision, I was like interviewing everybody to see like what they thought about this decision that I had to make. And it's because I had completely lost trust in my own judgment. And so like I would bring in anger to, like, the balance between anger and shame, maybe specifically, as kind of crucial for trusting oneself.
Yeah. It's funny. We started off by kind of talking about what it's like to not trust yourself, right? This is what happens. And I think so many people are taught this. Don't trust yourself. You're not safe to trust. But honestly, like, what can you do but trust yourself first? How can you trust anybody else? It's not fair to yourself. I'm really angry on this point because of all those years where I was looking, like you, Sherry, I was looking to other people for validation of what I wanted for myself, of what I knew for myself.
Yeah.
Right. And our educational system, the way we're educated is very much that way of like, there is a person with an answer, and that person's probably not you as a student, and you have to go out and find that answer. So even there's so many systems in place that really don't bring it back to the individual to say, well, what do you think about that? You know, how are you feeling about that? What's your insight? Like, that's a ideal idea for us to do with our children and ourselves. But it's really interesting, because when the authority in any situation is outside of yourself, it almost like we just bypass any emotions or thoughts we might be having.
And even with just in the families, like raising children, it's, I don't have children, so I don't have the experience, but it's like, how else to teach your children what's right or wrong besides telling them like what's right or wrong? And then they're getting it externally. How, like, at what point, and how do you transition? And for most people, for a lot of people, it doesn't happen, obviously, until later, much later.
That's such a good point. Yeah. I have a 3-year-old, and I'm really like trying to figure out this line of, no, you can't put toilet paper in all the toilet paper into the toilet. No, you can't stop doing that, right? Right? Or don't spit on me. It's rude. So I'm telling her these things, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, how can I do this without shaming her? I'm not trying to shame her into stopping. I'm just trying to help her understand that it is it's not a nice thing. And then, like, what is the construction behind nice and not nice and rude and polite?
But I do think that there is a developmental stage that we go through where we're looking, it's like more towards adolescence, where we're trying to find out who we are in the world. And so I think that, let's say it's adolescence and you don't have any emotional skills, right? And you don't have any insight about what's going on here. It can be really hard to find yourself, because then you're pulled into your peers and what they're doing. And that skill of coming back and bringing it back to yourself and thinking, how do I feel about this? This is important. Do I trust my own sense about this? It can really get lost for so many years, because you're always looking for someone else to reflect it back to yourself. It's very interesting. But yet, what we're here for is to talk about the trusting messages that we can give to not only ourselves, but the people we work with, the children you might have. How can we support the trusting emotions and point them out and model them so that we can really grow that part of ourselves.
That's a really good point. I think a lot of our ability to trust ourselves comes from knowing what our limits are, knowing what our capabilities are. And a lot of that is related to having like core beliefs, or in DEI, we talk about it as contracts that are up to date. They have to be current with what is going on in your life right now, right? It can't be from 20 years ago. Yeah. Unless that still works for you, right? It can't be unrealistic. Having unrealistic expectations is one of the, I think, cruelest things you can do for yourself, because you're never going to live up to them. you're always going to fall short. And in that way, you're never going to trust yourself, because you'll always think, oh, I want to do this, but I don't know if I can. I've never done something like this before. I've never finished something. I've never, so there's always that doubt, because you're setting these really unrealistic expectations for yourself. And then they have to be appropriate, right? The way that you acted 10 or 15 years ago, or even last week, it may not be appropriate for the situation you're in right now. So having those contracts up to date, I think, is so key. And that requires a lot of soul searching and personal awareness of what those core beliefs or those contracts are telling you, who you should be, how you should be acting, what your identity is, and if that's in alignment with what you want or what you don't want. It takes time, right? First, you have to become aware of those contracts and make the connection between I have a contract and I'm acting it out, right? And then you need to decide, is this realistic? Is this current? Is this appropriate? If it's not, burn the contract or renegotiate, and then find a way to go forward. And oftentimes it can be very quick. Sometimes it's not so quick. Sometimes it's really a process.
Well, and that reminds me too, it's at that point you need the sadness family emotions in order to change the contracts or burn them, or right, and forgive yourself for the past mistakes where or whatever. And so those are crucial emotions too in self-trust, because you can't move past, it's a learning process, right? Like you sometimes like, oh, I think I can do this thing, and then you screw it up, and then it's like, okay, now I know. You kind of learn. You have to learn what your limits are in so many different areas as you're growing, and then if you didn't learn them when you were younger, and you're just kind of thrown into the deep water once you're older and more independent, it feels so often there's a lot of shame around that, because it's like, I should have learned these things when I was younger, but that was out of your hands perhaps. And just that process of being able to let go of the mistakes necessary in order to figure out where your own sense of safety and security is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, envies are part of it too, I think. Maybe envy and anxiety as a way of like giving you a marker to look forward to. Oh, I want to be a different person. I don't want to be like this anymore. I want to be able to trust myself. That was actually honestly a marker I had for myself for a long time. Once I realized, like, I don't even, what does it feel like to trust myself? I don't even know. So my envy was definitely like, I want to be able to be someone who knows myself and can trust what I feel to be true, what I know to be true. And then there's the fear and the intuition part of it, right? I mean, when you trust yourself, you are able to listen to your emotions. You're able to listen to your intuition without maybe really knowing what it's about. But you're like, okay, well, I've got a feeling that maybe I need to make this phone call today, not tomorrow, but today, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, fully. I mean, in my experience with the emotions, my anxiety goes out so far and so fast that it's like a racehorse. It's not going to let anybody catch up, any other emotions catch up, to let the shame and the envy really inform my decisions. So now that I've kind of learned to rebalance, and like anxiety can be there, but it doesn't have to lead everything, that to listen to envy is such a gift, or listen to jealousy too, right? And to listen to our shame messages and figuring out first, is this right? Is this going on? How do I really feel about it? And giving myself the time and the space to actually do that work. Where when I was being led by a lot of like, probably more like panic, and I was panicking my way through lots of decisions, I never gave myself the time and space to really dwell and think like, what do I think about this? I was much more reactive to what was outside of me than inside of myself. And as I've been able to listen, one of the great outcomes is trusting myself much more. The self-confidence that comes from being able to stop and listen, and to really tend to and listen to the emotions, has been it's really profound in terms of how different I relate to myself, in terms of, especially with all of this great information from our emotions.
Absolutely.